The morning in Houston, Texas, was eerily still, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The neighborhood appeared unchanged, peaceful in its routine. It was the kind of place where life moved at an easy pace, where people believed trouble belonged elsewhere. But appearances could be misleading, and silence often concealed deeper truths. Evelyn Brooks stepped onto the sidewalk, pulling her hoodie snug as she tightened her shoelaces. To any passerby, she was just another jogger, blending into the early hours. But Evelyn was no ordinary woman. She was Judge Evelyn Brooks, a name that carried authority, a woman whose courtroom decisions had the power to alter lives and shape justice. Out here, though, there were no lawyers, no court officials, no weight of the gavel pressing against her. This was her time, a brief escape before facing another day that would challenge her in ways she had yet to realize. "Nothing," Evelyn stated firmly, but her words didn't matter. "Turn around," Jack snapped. "You're resisting an investigation." Evelyn stood still. She had witnessed this scene unfold countless times in her courtroom, moments where rights were ignored, where bias turned assumptions into accusations. "Officer," she said quietly, "you're making a mistake." But Jack wasn't listening. His hand clamped around her wrist. She set off down the familiar streets, her footsteps steady against the pavement. This routine was more than exercise. It was her sanctuary, a chance to clear her mind. But today, her thoughts lingered on the case awaiting her in court. One centered on police misconduct and racial bias. It was a case that carried personal weight, one she had examined from every angle, dissecting testimonies and poring over damning evidence. The truth was undeniable, yet she knew not everyone would be willing to face it. Still, that moment of reckoning was hours away. For now, she focused on the crisp morning air filling her lungs, the warmth of the rising sun against her skin, the illusion of normalcy. A few blocks away, Officer Jack Barnes sat in his patrol car, his coffee untouched, turning lukewarm in the cup holder. He had worked this neighborhood for years, knew every house, every car, every face that belonged. He saw himself as a guardian of order, someone who kept the streets safe and predictable. But Jack's perception of safety came with a flaw. If someone didn't match his idea of who should be here, his mind immediately framed them as a threat. His gaze locked onto Evelyn as she moved through the quiet streets, a lone figure, hood pulled up, a small gym bag swinging at her side. His instincts flared. She wasn't a regular. He didn't recognize her. Suspicion crept in. "Who's that?" he muttered, leaning forward, his focus narrowing. To him, she wasn't just a jogger enjoying the morning. She was someone who didn't fit. And in Jack's world, that meant trouble. Evelyn stopped near a park bench, rolling her shoulders as she reached for her water bottle, oblivious to the eyes watching her. The low rumble of an idling engine shattered the quiet, pulling Evelyn from her moment of peace. She cast a brief glance over her shoulder but dismissed it, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of her breath. A few feet away, Officer Jack Barnes watched her intently, his suspicion sharpening as something slipped from her grasp. A small piece of paper fluttering to the ground. A receipt. He couldn't make out the details, but his mind leapt ahead, filling in the blanks. "What's she carrying?" he muttered, already certain there was something off. Evelyn, oblivious to his scrutiny, turned to continue her jog. The sudden slam of a car door stopped her in her tracks. "Excuse me, ma'am." The voice was firm, edged with authority. She turned to face him, calm and composed. "Yes, officer?" Jack's gaze flickered to the gym bag at her side, then to the receipt now crumpled in his grip. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Evelyn raised an eyebrow but remained polite. "I'm out for a jog." Jack's fingers tightened around the slip of paper. It was from an upscale store. He frowned. "Where'd you get this?" She blinked, caught off guard. "That's mine. I must have dropped it." "These are expensive items," Jack said, skepticism creeping into his tone. "What's in the bag?" A chill ran through Evelyn despite the warmth of the morning sun. She recognized this moment, knew exactly where it was heading. "Officer," she said steadily, "I haven't done anything wrong." Jack stepped closer, his stance firm, his voice sharp. "Then you won't mind showing me the bag?" Evelyn hesitated, not because she had anything to hide, but because she knew her rights. "You don't have probable cause," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. Jack's expression darkened. Confidence to him looked like defiance. "Refusing to comply, huh?" he said, raising his voice just enough to make sure anyone nearby could hear. "What are you hiding?" "Nothing," Evelyn stated firmly, but her words didn't matter. "Turn around," Jack snapped. "You're resisting an investigation." Evelyn stood still. She had witnessed this scene unfold countless times in her courtroom. Moments where rights were ignored, where bias turned assumptions into accusations. "Officer," she said quietly, "you're making a mistake." But Jack wasn't listening. His hand clamped around her wrist, the cold bite of handcuffs tightening against her skin. "You're under arrest for suspicion of theft and resisting an officer," he announced for all to hear. Evelyn didn't resist. She didn't argue. She met his gaze, her own steady and knowing. "You have no idea what you've just done." As Jack led her toward his patrol car, her head remained high, her face unreadable. Around them, bystanders had begun to gather, phones raised, recording every second of what was happening. A jogger in handcuffs, an officer throwing out accusations, and no one, not even Jack, realizing the gravity of his actions, because the woman he had just arrested wasn't just anyone. She was Judge Evelyn Brooks, a federal judge with power beyond anything he could comprehend. And his mistake? It wouldn't just cost him his career, it would expose a truth far bigger than him. Jack leaned against the counter, chuckling as he spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Another one who thought she could talk her way out of it," he said, shaking his head. "You should have seen her face when I cuffed her." A nearby officer barely looked up from his paperwork. "What'd she do?" Jack smirked, holding up the crumpled luxury store receipt. "Suspicious behavior. Couldn't explain how she got this. And the hesitation? That's what really got me." Across the room, Officer Ryan Daniels listened quietly, his unease growing. Daniels wasn't like Jack. He still believed in fairness, in looking at the facts before making decisions. And something about this entire situation didn't sit right. "Suspicious behavior?" Daniels asked, stepping closer. "What exactly did she do?" Jack rolled his eyes, as if the answer was obvious. "She had a designer receipt, a gym bag, alone, in a hoodie. Didn't look like she belonged, if you know what I mean." Daniels' frown deepened. "Did she resist?" Jack scoffed. "She didn't cooperate. Same thing." Daniels said nothing, but his gut told him this was wrong. He glanced toward the holding cell where Evelyn Brooks sat, composed and unshaken. Her posture was straight, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look guilty. She looked prepared. Inside the cell, the cold gray walls pressed in around her. The narrow bench was hard beneath her, but Evelyn didn't shift, didn't slouch. She wouldn't let her composure slip. Not here, not now. Her breathing remained steady, her eyes fixed on the door ahead. But beneath her stillness, fury simmered. A federal judge, wrongfully arrested, stripped of dignity, tossed into a cell without cause. And all because Officer Jack Barnes had decided she didn't belong. Outside, Jack paced the hallway, his confidence swelling with every step. He still had no idea who Evelyn really was. To him, she was just another suspect, another person who dared to challenge his authority. And Jack Barnes didn't like being challenged. He stopped in front of the cell, leaning lazily against the bars, his smirk dripping with condescension. "You're awfully quiet in there," he mused, his voice echoing through the empty corridor. "Cat got your tongue?" Evelyn met his gaze, calm and unwavering. Jack's smirk faltered, just for a second, but he recovered quickly. "I'll tell you one thing," he continued, stepping closer. "What happens next? Stay with us as this story unfolds. When those in power abuse their authority, who holds them accountable? Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe." Jack's tone turned mocking, his smirk widening. "You're going to be sitting in that cell for a long time, Nobody's coming for you." Still, Evelyn said nothing. Jack's expression darkened. He didn't like being ignored. To him, silence was disrespect. "You think you're better than me?" he snapped, his voice sharp, laced with simmering resentment. "You think you're special? Let me tell you something, you're not." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice soft but cutting through the tension like a blade. "Are you finished?" Jack's jaw tightened. Her composure felt like salt in an open wound. He wanted her to yell, to argue, to fight back. But her stillness, it unnerved him. It made him feel small. "You should be careful how you talk to me," he sneered, lowering his voice to a warning whisper. "I could make things a whole lot worse for you." Evelyn didn't blink. "You've already made a mistake you can't undo." Her words hit their mark. Jack's face flushed red, his nostrils flaring. He jabbed a finger through the bars, his voice rising. "You're in no position to tell me anything. You think you can talk down to me? You think you're some kind of queen?" Evelyn's voice remained steady. "You should walk away, Officer Barnes." Jack's fists clenched. His breathing was heavy, the air between them thick with unspoken threats. He stepped closer to the bars, his face just inches from hers, his words dripping with malice. "You're lucky I even let you sit in there," he hissed. "People like you don't get second chances." Evelyn finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she stood, her presence towering over his anger. She stepped forward until they were eye to eye, her stare steady, unwavering. "People like me," she repeated, her voice quiet but firm. "Is that what you tell yourself to justify your actions?" Jack's face twisted with rage. He acted before he thought. His hand shot through the bars, striking Evelyn hard across the face. The slap echoed through the empty hallway, a sharp, sickening crack. For a moment, everything froze. Evelyn staggered slightly, her hand moving to her cheek, but she didn't fall. She didn't cry out. She straightened, and then she did what Jack never expected. She looked him in the eyes, calm, cold, unshaken. And in that moment, for the first time, Jack Barnes felt something unfamiliar. Fear. The weight of Officer Jack Barnes's slap lingered on Judge Evelyn Brooks's cheek. But the sting wasn't what unsettled her most. It was the chilling realization that, in this moment, she was entirely at his mercy. And Jack? He felt no remorse, no hesitation. If anything, striking her had only bolstered his arrogance, feeding the dangerous sense of power he relished. Evelyn leaned back against the cold wall of the holding cell, her heart beating steadily beneath her calm exterior. Outwardly, she remained composed, but deep inside, a seed of fear took root. What if no one came? What if she was left here, trapped, with no one to hold Jack accountable? She had encountered men like him before, men who wielded authority recklessly, unchallenged, unchecked. She had seen firsthand the depths they would sink to when they believed no one was watching. And for the first time in years, Judge Evelyn Brooks felt afraid. Beyond the bars, Jack stood tall, his self-satisfaction hanging thick in the air. He shot her a smirk, his voice dripping with cruel amusement. "You really think someone's coming for you?" he sneered. "You're wasting your time. People like you. You don't matter here." Evelyn slowly lifted her gaze, locking eyes with him. She didn't speak. She knew there were no words that could reach a man like Jack Barnes. But her silence only fueled his frustration. "I should have known you'd be trouble the moment I saw you," he muttered, stepping closer to the bars. "That sharp tongue of yours won't save you now. In here, you're nothing, just another suspect." Her hands tightened into fists on her lap, but she kept her breathing steady. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Yet his words, laced with malice, chipped away at the barrier between her composure and the unease creeping in. "You should be grateful I'm letting you sit there in peace," Jack added, his voice dark and threatening. "Things could be a whole lot worse for you." With one last glare, he turned and strode down the hallway, his footsteps echoing ominously. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the cold, lifeless cell. Evelyn flinched at the noise, but remained still, her resolve tightening. Jack thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming. For the first time, The silence truly unsettled her. Evelyn leaned back against the cold, unforgiving wall of the cell, her fingers grazing the tender bruise on her cheek. The quiet wasn't calming. It was suffocating. Her mind raced with thoughts she wished she could suppress. She had heard the stories before, accounts of people who vanished in places like this, swallowed by unchecked power and the eerie stillness of forgotten halls. What if no one knew where she was? What if her attorney hadn't been contacted? The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each passing second stretching into eternity. She swallowed hard, desperately wishing for a way, any way, to make a phone call. She had people who would come for her, people who would set things right. But Jack had stripped her of that connection, cutting her off from the outside world. A quiet whisper escaped her lips, unsteady but determined. "I need to get out of here." Evelyn closed her eyes, forcing herself to stay composed. Fear could not win. She had faced injustice before. She had fought battles in courtrooms where truth had to claw its way to the surface. But as the minutes dragged into hours, doubt crept in like a shadow, cold and relentless. Would anyone realize she was missing in time? What if Jack came back? What if something worse happened? The thought sent a chill down her spine. She was a federal judge, a woman who had dedicated her life to upholding justice. And yet, in this moment, she was powerless. Jack Barnes had the system on his side. Then the sound of footsteps, soft, hesitant, echoed through the corridor. These weren't Jack's. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her body tensing. A young officer appeared at the cell door, Officer Ryan Daniels. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the empty hallway before stepping cautiously toward the bars. His expression was conflicted, unease and guilt etched into his features. "Ma'am," Daniels whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Are you okay?" Evelyn studied him carefully. She recognized him from earlier, the one who had questioned Jack's actions. He looked young, inexperienced, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her he still believed in the badge for the right reasons. "I'll be fine," she answered, her voice even. "But I need to make a phone call." Daniels hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. "I'm not supposed to," he murmured, his voice laced with uncertainty. He glanced back at the hallway, his conflict written all over his face. "Please," Evelyn urged, her tone firm yet understanding. "You know this isn't right." Daniels shifted on his feet, his internal struggle clear. "If Barnes finds out I helped you, I'm done," he whispered, his voice barely holding steady. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "If you don't help me," she replied, her voice low and resolute, "he gets away with it." Daniels froze, her words slicing through his hesitation like a knife. She was right. If he didn't act now, this wouldn't be the last time Jack abused his power. Taking a deep breath, Daniels reached for his keys. The soft click of the lock releasing filled the quiet hallway. Evelyn stood, her movements slow and deliberate, the dim light casting shadows across her bruised cheek. "I'll take you to the phone," Daniels whispered. "But you have to be quick." Evelyn gave him a small nod, regaining her composure as she stepped out of the cell. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but firm. Moving cautiously, Daniels led her down the corridor, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. At the end of the hall, he pushed open a door to a small, empty office. "The phone's on the desk," he said, stepping aside. "I'll keep watch." Evelyn picked up the receiver, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed a number she knew by heart. The moment the line connected, she didn't hesitate. "This is Judge Evelyn Brooks," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I need you at the precinct immediately. Bring the case file." Daniel's expression shifted as the realization hit him. His lips parted in shock as he mouthed the word, "Judge?" Without another word, he quickly led her back to her cell, slipping away before anyone noticed. But it was too late. The truth was already spreading through the station like wildfire. "Did he just arrest a judge?" one officer whispered. Murmurs grew into a low hum of conversation. In the break room, Jack Barnes lounged back in his chair, still blissfully unaware of the storm about to hit. Then, the front doors of the station burst open. A man in a sharp, impeccably tailored suit strode inside, his expression unreadable but commanding instant attention. The room fell silent. He wasn't just any visitor. He exuded authority, the kind that carried weight. "Where is Judge Evelyn Brooks?" he asked, his voice firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. Officers exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping in. In the doorway, Jack appeared, his usual smugness faltering. "Judge?" Jack repeated, his voice suddenly weak. The man turned his gaze on him, his expression icy and unforgiving. "Are you the officer who arrested her?" Jack hesitated. She was acting suspicious." The man didn't even blink. "Suspicious?" he echoed, his tone laced with quiet fury. "You handcuffed and detained a federal judge without probable cause. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jack opened his mouth, but no words came. Around the room, officers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the situation sinking in. The attorney turned to the police chief, who had appeared at the commotion. "I want Judge Brooks released immediately." The chief's expression darkened. He turned sharply toward Jack, his voice cold and final. "In my office. Now." Jack's world began to collapse around him. The cracks in his confidence were spreading, and this time there was no covering them up. Meanwhile, Judge Evelyn Brooks stepped out of the holding room, her head high, her dignity intact. Evelyn Brooks walked out of the holding cell, her head high, her composure unshaken. Jack Barnes stood frozen, his arrogance shattered, his face drained of color. What he had assumed was a routine arrest had spiraled into something far beyond his control, a mistake that would cost him dearly. But this wasn't just about him. It was about a system that had allowed officers like him to act without accountability for far too long. And Evelyn, she wasn't just a victim. She was a judge, a fighter, and now the catalyst for exposing a truth that had been ignored for too long. The station buzzed with hushed conversations, whispers spreading like wildfire. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, their murmurs carrying the weight of disbelief. Jack, once so sure of himself, now felt the walls closing in. This wasn't just about his own poor judgment. This was about a system built on unchecked power, on assumptions, on bias. And now that system was being dragged into the light. The police chief stormed into his office, his expression thunderous. Jack followed, his once unshakable confidence reduced to a fragile thread. The door slammed behind them, the sound ringing through the station like a warning. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" the chief demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at him. "You arrested a federal judge, with no probable cause, no evidence, and not a shred of common sense," Jack stammered, scrambling for an excuse. "She was acting suspicious, sir. She hesitated. She refused to cooperate." The chief's eyes narrowed, his voice dangerously low. "Suspicious? Because she dropped a receipt while jogging in her own neighborhood? Because she didn't immediately comply with an officer who had no right to stop her in the first place?" Jack swallowed hard, his earlier bravado crumbling. I didn't know she was a judge," he mumbled weakly. "And that is exactly the problem," the chief snapped. "You didn't know, you didn't ask, you just assumed. Do you have any idea how this makes us look? This is already all over the internet. There's footage of her in handcuffs, and when people realize who she is, this department is going to be torn apart." Jack's face turned ghostly pale as the chief continued. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending an investigation. And if I find out this wasn't just incompetence, if I find any evidence this was racially motivated, you're finished. Do you understand me?" Jack could only nod, his throat too dry to form words. The consequences of his actions were no longer distant possibilities. They were here, and they were real. Meanwhile, in a quiet office at the station, Judge Evelyn Brooks sat across from her attorney. Her hands rested calmly on the table, her posture straight. She had handled high-pressure cases before. She had issued rulings that changed lives, made headlines. But this was different. This was personal. Her attorney flipped open a thick case file and set it in front of her. Evelyn glanced at it briefly before meeting his gaze. "We're taking this public," the attorney said firmly. "What they did to you, the way they ignored your rights, this isn't just unacceptable. It's systemic, and it's not the first time." Evelyn's voice was steady but filled with resolve. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about a system that allows this to happen to so many others. Today, it was me. Tomorrow, it'll be someone without the resources to fight back." The attorney nodded and reached into his bag, pulling out a small recorder. He pressed play, and Jack Barnes's voice filled the room. The arrogance, the dismissiveness, the veiled threats. The proof of his abuse of power was undeniable. "You think this is enough?" the attorney asked. Evelyn's expression didn't waver. "It's a start." Outside, the world was already watching. News outlets picked up the story. Social media erupted in outrage. The footage of Evelyn in handcuffs spread like wildfire. Federal judge arrested without cause. Racial profiling caught on camera. Clips of the arrest circulated alongside the audio recording, amplifying public anger. It wasn't just about Evelyn. It was about the fact that if this could happen to her, a woman of power and influence, then it was happening to countless others without a voice. The protests started almost immediately. Crowds gathered outside the precinct, holding signs, chanting for justice. The movement grew, fueled by years of frustration, of people tired of seeing injustice go unchecked. And then, in the middle of the crowd, something unexpected happened. Officer Ryan Daniels, the young officer who had hesitated, who had questioned Jack's version of events, stepped forward. He stood in front of reporters, his face pale but his voice steady. "What happened to Judge Brooks was wrong," he said, "and it's time we take a hard look at ourselves, at how we police, and at the biases that exist in our system." His words spread just as quickly as the footage. Some called him brave. Others called him a traitor. But Daniels didn't care. He had seen the truth, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. As public pressure mounted, the department launched a full-scale investigation into Jack Barnes. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Old complaints resurfaced, reports of racial profiling, excessive force, unjustified arrests. One man came forward. "He pulled me over for no reason." A woman added, "He accused me of theft because I looked suspicious." The patterns were undeniable. Jack's career, once built on authority and control, was unraveling. Days later, Evelyn stood in front of a packed town hall. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes, and the community waited in silence for her to speak. She took a breath, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "What happened to me should never have happened," she said, "but it does, every day, to people who look like me, to people whose voices are ignored." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I was lucky. I knew my rights. I had the resources to fight back. But what about those who don't? How many others have been silenced by fear, by shame, by a system that fails to protect them?" The room was still. "This isn't just about one officer," she continued. "It's about a culture that teaches some to judge and others to fear. That culture has to change, and it starts here, with us." The crowd erupted in applause. Evelyn's story was no longer just a personal ordeal. It was a call to action, a demand for accountability. Jack Barnes had thought he could silence her. He had assumed his authority would go unquestioned. But what he hadn't realized was that Evelyn Brooks wasn't just a judge. She was a fighter. And his actions? They had just handed her the proof she needed to expose a broken system. The fallout was far from over. The investigation was just beginning. The protests weren't stopping. And this fight? It was only getting started. And as for Jack Barnes, he thought he had already faced the worst of it. The suspension, the public shame, the scrutiny. But the truth has a way of surfacing, and the mistakes he had tried so hard to bury, they were about to come back in a way no one saw coming. Inside the police station, the tension was thick, the air charged with uncertainty, as investigators dug through Jack Barnes's case files. They unearthed patterns too disturbing to overlook, complaints of racial profiling, false arrests, and the quiet suffering of victims who had been ignored for far too long. But then something unexpected happened. An investigator stumbled upon a file that had been sealed away, hidden deep in the system, one no one expected to find. The file was linked to an incident from years ago, eerily similar to Evelyn's arrest. "What is this?" the investigator muttered as they flipped through the old records. The name Isaac Taylor jumped out at them, a young black man who had been arrested under questionable circumstances. As the investigator continued to read, they found gaps in the paperwork, inconsistencies in Jack's report, and most damning of all, a missing body cam recording, which Jack had claimed malfunctioned. Without hesitation, the investigator made the call. "Get Judge Brooks on the line. She needs to see this." At her office, Evelyn sat with her attorney reviewing the growing pile of evidence against Jack Barnes. While the complaints were damning enough to destroy his career, the sealed file was something else entirely. When the investigator handed her the documents, Evelyn's calm expression shifted, now sharpened with purpose. "Who is Isaac Taylor?" she asked, her voice steady but focused. Her attorney answered quietly, 2 years ago I heard about this case. It was buried. The young man never got justice." Jack claimed the arrest was justified, but there were questions that no one bothered to ask. "This case is starting to make sense." Evelyn's voice became firm as she spoke again. "Jack Barnes didn't just profile me. He's been doing this for years. Isaac Taylor's case could be the evidence we need to prove that this is a pattern." Her attorney nodded. "What do you want to do?" Evelyn closed the file, her decision made. "Bring Isaac in. It's time to give him a voice." The next day, reporters gathered outside the courthouse, their cameras flashing as Evelyn Brooks stepped up to the podium. The crowd hushed in anticipation. "You all know my story," Evelyn began, her voice ringing out across the steps. "But this isn't just about me. This is about a pattern, a system that has failed for far too long." She paused and motioned toward the crowd. A young man stepped forward, Isaac Taylor, now in his early 20s. His face was serious and determined. The crowd gasped. 2 years ago, Isaac had been arrested by Officer Jack Barnes under nearly identical circumstances. The body cam footage, conveniently lost, and Isaac had never seen justice. But today, that was about to change. Isaac spoke, his voice shaking but resolute. "I was just walking home when he stopped me. He accused me of stealing, said I looked suspicious. I didn't do anything wrong, but that didn't matter to him. I thought no one would believe me. I thought I was alone." Evelyn cut through the noise. "Isaac wasn't alone. None of us are. And Jack Barnes is about to answer for everything he's done." As the press conference ended, Evelyn's attorney approached her, his face unreadable. "Judge Brooks," he said quietly. "Someone else just came forward." Evelyn frowned. "Who?" The attorney handed her a slip of paper. "A retired officer who worked with Jack Barnes years ago. He says he has proof." Hours later, Evelyn sat across from the retired officer, a man in his 60s with tired eyes and a heavy burden. "Jack Barnes has been getting away with this for years," the officer confessed, his voice laden with guilt. "I covered for him. I saw what he did to people like Isaac, like you, but I kept quiet. I shouldn't have." Evelyn leaned forward. "What kind of proof do you have?" The man pulled out a dusty USB drive and set it on the table. "I kept copies of old body cam footage Jack thought he erased." Evelyn's heart raced as she stared at the drive. This was it, the missing piece of the puzzle, the irrefutable proof she needed to expose Jack Barnes once and for all. At the police station, Jack Barnes was summoned to a hearing. His usual arrogance had been replaced by visible fear as he walked into the packed room. Reporters, community leaders, and officers filled the seats, waiting for what would come next. At the front of the room, Evelyn sat with unwavering composure, the USB drive in hand. The contents had been reviewed, and what they revealed was damning. Video after video showed Jack harassing innocent black men and women, falsely accusing them, threatening them, and mocking them as he got away with it. When the footage played on the screen, the room fell silent. Jack's voice echoed through the speakers. "People like you don't belong here. You think you're smarter than me? No one's going to believe you." The room gasped. There was no denying it now. Jack's pattern of abuse, his bias, his lies, all of it laid bare for the world to see. The chief of police stood, his voice steady but stern. "Officer Jack Barnes, you are hereby terminated from the force, effective immediately. Your actions have disgraced this department and violated the trust of the community." Jack looked around, desperately seeking support, but found none. Even the officers who had once defended him turned their backs. Evelyn rose to her feet, her voice ringing through the room like a clap of thunder. "This isn't just about one man," she said. "It's about a system that has allowed men like him to operate unchecked. But today, we're sending a message. Justice cannot be silenced. Not anymore." The fight had been long, the truth buried deep, but in the end, justice prevailed. Jack Barnes had thought his power would shield him, but instead, it was his undoing. For Evelyn Brooks, this wasn't just personal. It was a pivotal moment, a turning point that exposed the deep flaws in a broken system and demanded change. The release of the USB footage sparked widespread reforms. Policies were rewritten, officers retrained, and Jack Barnes became a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when power is abused. But for Evelyn, this was only one step in a much larger journey. The fight for justice was far from over. As she walked out of the courthouse, head held high, the world knew one thing for certain: the truth always comes to light. Stay with us, like and subscribe, because while justice may have been served, the story is far from finished. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the case against Officer Jack Barnes reached its breaking point. Justice was the focus now, not just for the victims whose voices had been silenced, but for a system that had long turned a blind eye. For Barnes, this was the moment when all his buried secrets would be exposed. Evelyn Brooks had endured his abuse of power, but now she was using that very abuse to hold him accountable. As Jack sat at the defense table, his head lowered, the man who once believed he was untouchable looked small and defeated under the weight of his actions. Across the aisle, Evelyn remained poised, her presence commanding the room without a word. The judge entering wasn't Evelyn herself, but one of her esteemed colleagues, a reminder that the institution Jack had once manipulated would now pass judgment on him. The prosecution wasted no time. "This case," the attorney began sharply, "is about a pattern of racial profiling, abuse, and unchecked power. Officer Jack Barnes is not a rogue officer. He is a reflection of a system that has allowed this behavior to continue." Piece by piece, the evidence against Jack was laid out for the world to see. First came the USB drive, the retired officer's hidden footage of body cam recordings that Jack had thought he erased. As the footage played on the courtroom screen, Jack's own words filled the room. "You people don't belong here. You look guilty to me. Who's going to believe you over me?" Gasps rippled through the audience as Jack's defense attorney tried to object, but the damage was already done. Then came Isaac Taylor, the young man from 2 years ago. He took the stand, his voice steady despite the weight of his story. "I was walking home when Officer Barnes stopped me," Isaac said, his gaze fixed firmly on Jack. "I didn't do anything wrong, but he accused me of stealing. When I tried to explain, he arrested me anyway." The prosecutor held up a file. "Here is Officer Barnes's report from that day, full of gaps and false claims." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. He had no defense. Finally, Evelyn took the stand. The courtroom held its collective breath as she began. "The day Officer Barnes arrested me, I saw firsthand the consequences of unchecked power," she said, her voice strong and steady. "It wasn't about the truth. It was about control." She paused, her tone hardening. "This is not just about me. This is about a system that has allowed people like Officer Barnes to operate without accountability. That ends today." With the evidence overwhelming, Jack Barnes finally took the stand. His lawyer had prepared him to follow a script, show remorse, paint it as a misunderstanding. But under the weight of Evelyn's testimony, Jack faltered. The prosecutor pressed him. "You saw a black woman in a hoodie and made assumptions, didn't you, Officer Barnes?" Jack flushed and denied it, But the body cam footage told a different story. The prosecutor held it up as proof of Jack's bias. Jack's voice faltered, his arrogance crumbling as he desperately searched the room for support, but found only cold, unforgiving stares. The jury deliberated for hours, and outside, the crowd grew larger, chanting for justice. Finally, the doors opened and the jury filed in. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman stood, clearing his throat, and announced, "We find the defendant, Jack Barnes, guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and falsifying reports." The courtroom erupted in reaction. Reporters scrambled to write the headlines. Jack's face fell, his career shattered. But for Evelyn, this moment wasn't about him. It was about what came next. Standing before a sea of cameras and protesters outside the courthouse, Evelyn addressed the crowd. "This verdict is a victory," she said, her voice carrying over the noise. "But it is not the end. Jack Barnes is one man, but the system that allowed him to thrive must also be held accountable. We need reforms, we need accountability, and we must demand better." The crowd erupted in cheers, her words sparking a fire for change. In the months that followed, Evelyn's case set off a wave of reforms. Body cams became mandatory statewide. Policies were rewritten to ensure accountability. Officers were retrained in racial bias and de-escalation techniques. Evelyn worked tirelessly with community leaders, law enforcement, and local governments to ensure that change wasn't just promised, it was delivered. Jack Barnes became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when power is abused. But for Evelyn, the fight wasn't over. One evening, she stood in the park where her arrest had taken place. Children played nearby, families enjoyed the sunshine, and for the first time in a long while, the world felt peaceful. It was different. It was a reminder that change, though slow, was possible. A young girl approached Evelyn, her eyes wide with admiration. "Are you the judge from the news?" she asked. Evelyn smiled gently. "Yes, I am." The girl grinned. "I want to be like you someday." Evelyn knelt, her voice soft but strong. "You can be, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As the girl ran back to her family, Evelyn stayed behind, watching the sunset. Her heart was lighter than it had been in weeks. Justice had been served. Change had begun. And Evelyn Brooks wasn't finished fighting for a better world. This wasn't just the story of one officer or one arrest. It was about the power of truth, the resilience of those who fight for justice, and the courage to demand better. Because when power is abused, silence is not an option. As Judge Evelyn Brooks showed, the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always come to light. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Arc of Stories for more powerful tales of justice, resilience, and change. Together, we can make a difference, one story at a time.